Hi, this is Anne-Marie Gaddy from Classic Movie Hub, and I'm thrilled to be here today with Victoria Riskin, who is the daughter of actress Fay Wray, yes, that would be King Kong's Fay Wray, and screenwriter Robert Riskin, who penned some of the most beloved classics. It Happened One Night, Meet John Doe, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, You Can't Take It With You. So we're here today to talk about Victoria's new book, Fay Wray and Robert Riskin, A Hollywood Memoir. Thank you so much for being here today with us today, Victoria.
It's
good to see you.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
First of all, let me tell you that I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I found it so interesting and it was really fun to read. So I just wanted to start with, I guess, a very basic question. So I can't even imagine what it would be like to write a biography, no less a dual bio of two very famous parents. So can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to write the book and then how you went about it?
Well, the process was a little bit accidental. I started to write some little bits and pieces about my growing up, early days of Hollywood, being a child in Hollywood, just vignettes. And when I went back to read them, I realized that what I was really looking for was my parents. I wanted to find them again. I think for me, particularly my father was kind of frozen in time. I lost him when I was 10 years old, and he was a wonderful father. So I started to feel that I should get to know the man. And I began reading his letters and his scripts and correspondence that he had with my mother and watching his movies, and he began to come alive, and I read old newspaper stories so I could fill in the full picture. I knew my mother, of course, because she lived to 97 years of age, and she shared a lot with me, but even as close as we were, I felt I had to step back and look at her as a person, both of them, and see who these two remarkable people were. At least I came to the conclusion that they were remarkable. Not just mom and dad, but they were remarkable people, what they accomplished, their resilience, their sense of humor, their intelligence. And I fell in love with them as characters. And so it's been a wonderful but long journey to find them.
Well, I found the book I felt was very warmly written, very vivid. I felt like I was there, so thank you for that. I don't think we really get that kind of inside look into things, so as a fan, it was really interesting to read. I do want to ask you some questions first about your mom, and then maybe we'll segue to your dad, or we will. But I do want to start out with, so your mom didn't have really an easy childhood, right? So she grew up in poverty. Her mother sent her to Hollywood at a very young age, and by the time your mom was 18, she was the provider for her family. So that's an enormous feat for anyone, no less a girl at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about your mom's early days in films?
Sure. Well, it is kind of remarkable that she came to Hollywood at 14 and that she was working full-time and supporting a family by the time she was 18. And she was her mother was a very strict Victorian character, as you discovered in the book. But she had a kind of strength, and my mother did, a strength and resilience, and a sense of self-confidence deep down inside, and a determination. So her first assignments, she went to Hal Roach Studios and asked for a job. And I guess it was easy enough in those days. She walked in the door, and the guy said, "Okay, we'll give you a little 6-month contract." And there she was doing these wonderful little bits in Charlie Chase comedies. And often the brunt of the joke was on her, but anyway, you can see that she's comfortable and she's poised. So then she got a job working at Universal Studios in Westerns. And the studio was run by Carl Laemmle. Everybody knew him as Uncle Carl because he brought all of his relatives over from Europe, and they all worked at the studio, but she also called him Uncle Carl because he looked after her and all the young girls. They were hard, long days that she worked. The sun was blistering. They were doing westerns outside. They were on horses. They were in wagons. They were racing around. Sometimes, when they had to do a close-up, it would be already blistering hot with pancake makeup, and then they would hold the big reflector up. So, she was almost burning up or melting under the lights, but she loved it. She had one little accident, which I saw for the first time when I met you at Capitol Fest. in Wild Horse Stampede, there's a scene where there's a little accident in a wagon, and my mother had the slightest little imperfection in her nose, which I trace back to that moment. So, so thank you to all the people who sort of alerted me to that crash and said, "You got to see that film." I was able to reconnect with that. But the Cowboys took great care of her. She loved the Cowboys. They were very protective.
And then fast forward a little bit, and your mom became, or your mother became world famous when King Kong was released, right? King Kong in 1933.
Right.
And that was a really challenging film to make. It was no easy feat. So, long hours, physically, I think, tough. And I read the story that you told a story about when King Kong was holding your mom in his hand and she was struggling to escape, and you were saying that that really held some risk for her.
Yes. Well, first of all, I mean, Merian C. Cooper, who's a great character, and we can talk more about him. The original Kong was 18 inches high, right? So, and people who know about stop motion photography know how brilliantly they. But for her to be in Kong's hand, they had a giant hand and a cinch in a giant arm and a cinch in the hand, and they would strap her in and then lift her up 15, 20 feet high and tell her to struggle to try to get away. So she struggled to try to get away, and the cinch would become undone, and then she was struggling to hold on, and it was all a lot of struggling going on. She was afraid she would fall. So
that was quite a fall, right? It was like 40 something.
Yeah.
It was a long distance.
Well, I don't know how many feet, but it was enough to really get seriously injured.
Right.
And so she was screaming, "Let me down."
Right.
So some of the screaming was quite real for her. They worked sometimes 24 hours. And cute story about Merian C. Cooper was married to a wonderful actress, Dorothy Jordan, and he came home and bragged that he had worked my mother 24 hours, and she read him the riot act, and he never did it again. She said, "You can't do that to Fay."
I remember that in the book.
Yeah. It's a cute story.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Merian C. Cooper, because I think one of the things that, there's so many things I liked about the book. I mean, in addition to telling the story about your mother and the story about your father, you gave us a lot of context, and you told us a lot of stories that helped us fans understand about the personalities and the films, like what was going on at that time. And you told some great stories about Merian C. Cooper. Could you share maybe one of them?
He's probably one of the great characters of the 20th century, maybe one of the great characters I've ever run across, because he did not start out as a filmmaker. He started out as as an Air Force pilot, and he was shot down. There's a great story about this in World War I. He was shot down by a German airplane across enemy lines. They chased him across into the enemy territory. The plane caught on fire, and he wasn't able. His hands got burned, so severely burned that he couldn't move the. What do you call it? He couldn't. What do you call it?
I don't know.
Anyway, he couldn't move. He couldn't maneuver the plane, so he had to use his elbows and his knees to try to land the plane. And he had a guy in back, what they call the observer, who was in back, who was just helpless as they were heading for the ground. And they crashed the plane, but he was able, with the force of his elbows and his knees, to soften the blow. He was captured and he was put in prison. Then he went back and joined the Polish Air Force, and he led a group of Americans to fight the Russians. He was shot down again and captured and held prisoner. So that all happened even before he picked up a camera. He then did some amazing documentaries. He knew at some point that people wanted to hear about the mysterious parts of Africa or Persia or Asia. And then it was time for film, that they didn't want to just read these stories like Stanley and Livingston would, their stories in the newspapers. So he learned about cameras, and he teamed up with Ernest B. Schoedsack. And those two men were great, great friends, pals, and they made King Kong together eventually. Cooper was short, southern, intense, charming. Schoedsack was like a beanpole giant guy with a huge head and brilliant. He was a genius, and the two of them thought adventuring was fun, and so they followed the Bakhtiar tribe in Persia, 50,000 people across a mountain that was 15,000 feet high with their cameras, and a woman who had underwritten this project. And then they went off to Asia and they did another film called Chang. And to set up a scene, they buried themselves in the ground and had their cameras, and then they created an elephant stampede. I mean, these guys, their motto was distant, difficult, and you know, they just wanted to be part of a challenge.
It was really amazing. When I was reading all about that, it's hard to imagine lives like that. It's
Yes.
so interesting.
They were amazing. They were amazing men.
You know?
And kind of forgotten in the modern day world of King Kong. It's taken on its own new life. Right.
Now, your mom shared the movie King Kong with you when you were 9.
Right.
What did you think when you saw it?
She didn't want me to see the film for a long time because she thought it would be upsetting to me to see my mother in distress, you know. But finally it was on television, and she said, "I think you're ready to see it." So I put myself in front of the TV set, and I watched it. And she would come in the room and check on me to see if I was okay, and then, you know, pace back and forth, kind of pretending she was getting something in the kitchen, and she came in at the end, and I was sobbing. I was absolutely sobbing uncontrollably. And she said, "Oh, sweetheart," she said, "was it hard for you to see your mother in that kind of distress?" And I said, "No, you were mean to King Kong."
I love that.
And I couldn't get over it. I was sort of mad at her for about a week because I felt she was part of the conspiracy to hurt the Kong character, you know. But that's the genius of the film. Your heart goes out to the beast. And so that was one of my first sort of, I had experiences with Kong throughout my life, but that was my first
That was
one.
a very cute story. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent.
Okay,
It's purely selfish because I'm a big fan of the Marx Brothers. But what did you think when your mom first introduced you to Harpo Marx?
Right. So in our household, we had an old movie projector. And on rainy days or Saturdays, we would haul it out. My brother was a little bit older than me, and he could put the big reel on and show a movie. And one of the few movies that we had was A Night at the Opera. And we played that over and over again. I'm sure that the sprockets were starting to wear out. And we would laugh, and I just loved Harpo. I just adored him with his curly hair and his little horn and his funny coat with everything in it and his, you know, his knee thing. Anyway, I was so in love with this character. And so one day this gentleman came to the house, and he was wearing a beautiful suit, and he had a silk tie and a little silk handkerchief, and he was bald and kind of sparkly-eyed. And my mother, and he sat down, and my mother brought me over, and she said, "Honey, this is that wonderful, funny man that you like so much, Harpo Marx." And I looked at him, and I said, "She's playing a trick on me. That is not so." I could not disconnect I couldn't disconnect him from his character. And I ran upstairs, and I was kind of disappointed. I was trying to sort it all out.
It's confusing.
Yeah, it was confusing, right.
I think I'm going to move on a little bit to your father now.
Yeah.
So now your dad also was really driven at a young age. My gosh, I read, you know, you tell us that he was a movie producer at 17, then a Broadway producer. Right. Then he goes out to Hollywood in 1931 to work for Columbia Pictures. But then really, I guess, you know, his work with Frank Capra in 33 and 34 on Lady for a Day, It Happened One Night, that really catapulted the both of them to the top tier.
Absolutely, and not only the both of them, but the studio.
The studio.
You know, the studio was a second-tier kind of fly-by-night operation. Not fly-by-night, because Harry Cohn was a master entertainer, but there was a magic between the two of them. They hit it off. Capra was a wonderful director. He had great sense of style and movement, but he didn't have material that was really top-notch. And my father's screenplays were kind of a perfect balance, and had the philosophy that became kind of known for those films of the 1930s, the Capra Riskin films, all came from Riskin. And my father was a wonderful screenwriter, I think. If I read his screenplays today, I just am in awe.
Yeah, many fans would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's all on the page.
Yeah.
So you don't have to imagine someone else made it up, including the camera shots.
Right.
Which is an unusual thing. It would be considered disrespectful today to give a director a camera direction, but he thought that was all part of the architecture. Anyway, they became the story about Lady for a Day, which is a film I love, that was so successful that at the studio that you didn't have to requisition pencils, you could just get them freely, you know, because Harry Cohn was so stingy. And then they moved on to Broadway Bill and, you know, and other films, but and It Happened One Night, of course, was just put them over the top.
Yeah, and it swept the Academy Awards in 1934. As you mentioned, it took Columbia out of Poverty Row.
Right.
But that wasn't easy to cast, was it?
No, they had a lot of trouble. Most stars didn't want to come in, you know, A stars didn't want to come and work for Harry Cohn at Columbia. He made more of these B movies. And well, first of all, the only reason they got Clark Gable was because Gable was having a fight with Louis B. Mayer at MGM, and so he was sent. This was like punishment to go over and do this movie. You know, they traded stars, as we all know, like people trade baseball cards, right? But casting the female role was very tough. So they asked Myrna Loy, and they asked Margaret Sullivan, and they asked Miriam Hopkins and others, and they all turned it down. My father was dating Carol Lombard at the time, so he showed it to her. She loved the script, but her schedule would not permit her to do it. So finally, Claudette Colbert was on the list, and she said, absolutely not. I will not make this movie. I hate Frank Capra. They had made a movie together. They'd fought through the whole thing. And so my father went to Claudette Colbert, and he said I had to practically get on my knees, and I begged her until finally she relented. She also relented because Harry Cohn was willing to give her $50,000, which was
money.
Clark Gable got $10,000 for the picture. So I think money swayed her. She was a smart businesswoman. But perhaps some of the chemistry in the film is that these two actors didn't want to be in the film, and they had that in common.
Yeah.
And so it was almost hard to believe, but it turned into, you know, the first film to sweep all the top Oscars. And I think it holds up, don't you?
Oh my gosh, I know it by heart.
Yes, me too.
Actually, it's one of the first films my mother shared with me when I was a kid, and she used to explain to me, you know, about the walls of Jericho and all that, as you can explain it to a little girl, you know.
Right.
And oh my gosh, I remember staying up watching it with my mom. It's such a great movie. Now there's a scene in there, the piggyback scene, right? There's so many great scenes in that movie, my gosh. But the piggyback scene in particular has a special meaning for you.
Well, I just want to say that all the wonderful little repartee is Riskin-esque. That was my father. That's the man I knew. The piggyback scene has special meaning for me because my father used to give me piggyback rides. But it wasn't just that he did that. He always had little fun ways of doing it. So whenever he was trying to get us kids to line up and move in the right direction, he would be sort of like a parade leader, you know, and he would say, all right, lefterly, weaverly, and we would do this little march behind him. And I have a very vivid memory of his picking me up and putting me on his shoulders to give me a piggyback ride or a ride, and lefterly, weaverly into this wonderful ice cream shop on Hollywood Boulevard, C.C. Brown's, you know, and so he had this sort of magical way with children. I noticed in all the photographs I found of him, he's never looking down at us. He's always talking to us at eye level.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think it was thoughtfully done. Instinctive, but thoughtfully done. So anyway, the piggyback ride is kind of special.